And here comes Dawn Ray just as we're getting started. So we let Dawn Ray in. And welcome to Jazz Sessions number 21. This is our third week on making story models. We're going to talk about fortune graphs and beyond. But first, of course,
And McFly! I thought I told you never to come in here. What's it gonna cost me? How much money you got on you?
Well, how much you want, Biff?
it's getting harder and harder to find good movie clips that are about money and payment. If you happen to know of any that you think would be cool, drop me a line. Grok gave me a whole bunch that it said, hey, you should try these. And I think most of them are hallucinations because I have trouble finding them in the movies they're talking about. But this one was one that certainly works.
And McFly!
So this is, of course, for our paying for the soup, because again, I'm hoping to sell some books. In particular, besides making story models, which is what this week's session is based on, I have, again, a fine and dangerous season. I'm getting ready to do an October advertising and marketing campaign for this because it is an October book. The entire time I was writing it, I was saying, this is not a Halloween book. This has nothing to do with Halloween. I am just coincidentally writing this in October, and it ended up being a Halloween book. So I'm hoping to get an ad campaign going for that one. Budget's going to be interesting, and see if I have the budget to make it pay off. If you're interested, check the QR code there. This is, of course, the common point where I say we're talking about tools, not rules. Anyone telling you the rules for writing is either naive or selling you something. Everything is tools. There are no rules. The only real rule is you have to write. Everything else is a tool. Because as Goldman told us, nobody knows anything. If there was a rule that would work for certain every time, every movie would be a hit. Every book would be a bestseller, which of course is nonsense. It's meaningless. Everything is just tools you try, and sometimes they work, and sometimes that was the wrong tools. Even if I say it, if I call something a rule, keep in mind it's still a tool. All right, so last week we talked about object diagrams. We talked about people, we talked about objects, we talked about maps of places, and we also talked about plot diagrams and Murphy points. And Dawn Ray is coming in again. Let Dawn Ray in again. We talked about plot diagrams and Murphy points, which are a cool diagram for thinking through alternate ways your story could play out. They are one way of looking at your story structure. They are not the only way by any means. They are very cool for making up your mind. They are not necessarily a way of looking at the whole emotional tension, fortune structure of your story. So we're going to be looking at some diagrams for that this week. It's a lot of slides. It's probably going to exceed the hour. Anybody surprised? I don't think so. But we're going to talk about this in terms of classical story structure and then Vonnegut for story structure, and I'll explain why it's called that. A big point in story structure in general is what we call an inflection point, where something changes in the story. A turning point is a change in the story. Something goes happy to sad, relaxed to tense, love to hate, rich to poor, or vice versa on any of these. A turning point is, gee, something happened different than what was already happening. There are those who will argue that you need a turning point practically every scene, that the whole point of a scene is something changed. If nothing changed, why are you telling it? Now you might say, well, I'm telling it because I want to explore the character. This is where Deborah Chester's book, The Fantasy Fiction Formula, which she later re-released as The Fiction Formula because people who weren't writing fantasy wouldn't buy the book, and it's a cool book. In the fantasy fiction formula, she talks about a structure called scene and sequel. Now, this doesn't mean sequel like in The Empire Strikes Back is a sequel to Star Wars, because episode 4, as we call it today, is Star Wars in my head. No, not like Empire is a sequel. In this case, scene is something is happening. The story is changing. Action, tension, conflict. Sequel is the characters absorbing what has changed, trying to understand what has changed, figuring out what this meant to them. Sequel is after the fight, when you're nursing your wounds and cursing because the attacker got away with it and before you could stop them. And now you're trying to think, who could it have been? What might that have been about? That's sequel. Scene is where your turning points generally happen, where you're seeing a change in some aspect of the story. Sequel is, oh, wow, I don't know what's going on anymore. That's the concept of a turning point. An inflection point is a turning point where there's no going back. Somehow the story divides into before and after. Now, you will get massive arguments about this. This is why turning point or inflection points are subjective. You'll get massive arguments in where the inflection points are in a given story. In going back to Star Wars, the original, the inflection point for the first act, almost everybody's going to say it is when they come back to the farm and the uncle and aunt are dead. And Luke's like, okay, there's nothing for me here now. Let's go take care of this mission. Up until that point, he might have been talked out of it. Now, realistically, you and I could write a story where he just gets so upset about this that he digs into the farm and says, I'm going to make their farm what it always should have been, and I don't want to have any part of all this big stuff going on in space. We could write that story, but nobody'd read it, and the movie would have never gotten made. There is something in the character that makes the inflection point, the point where after this, the world has changed. So this is kind of the point that divides parts of the structure, basic structural unit in story structure. Hey, I pressed the button. I did press the button. There we go. So let's talk about some examples. That was one in Star Wars, the point where, hey, family's dead. We are going to go out to space now. Another inflection point. Oh, we're bringing David back. We lost David somehow. Another inflection point is when they've gotten away in the Millennium Falcon and they're heading off to rejoin the Rebel Alliance. And now they know that the Death Star exists and they know that they're going to have to stop it somehow. They can either do that or just sit around and wait for the Empire to wipe them out. So there's some examples of inflection points. In general, it is a decision or a disaster. Something has changed that you can't go back, or something has changed that you won't put up with. So for Leia, because different characters might have different inflection points, for Leia, having your homeworld blown to bits is kind of a can't go back disaster. She is now fully committed. For Luke, yeah, that's a bad thing. But for Luke, it was more personal. It was the family getting killed. So some examples of inflection points. Come on. Now, the very, very first story structure you find discussed in history is the simple one, beginning, middle, ending. Where did you start? Where did you end? What happened in between? Now, this seems almost too simple to even discuss. But when you hear people talking about troubles with their stories, you'll hear most commonly 3 different things. I don't know where to begin, I don't know how to end, or I'm lost in the muddy middle. Those are naturally how we think of our stories, is we have a beginning point, We have stuff that happens heading towards an ending point. So all other discussions of story structure assume beginning, middle, ending. And realistically, we have these. We must have these. You cannot have a story without these. Your story did not exist yesterday. You started writing some words down. That is part of a beginning or a middle or an ending. If you never write anything else, then it is all three. So realistically, you have to have a story start somewhere, and it doesn't go on forever, so it has an ending. The middle is where it might wander who knows how long, how far, whereabouts. But if you have a finished story, you will have beginning, middle, ending. But you might not necessarily tell the actual beginning. You might have a beginning and then you have the beginning of the story. So if you have a lot of backstory, that is beginning in your head. That is not beginning in the reader's experience. I'm in the middle of working on a story for a possible anthology call, and in that story, I know it is starting with the protagonist and a friend driving through the woods to the location where a movie was shot. But immediately it starts being about things that happened years before that movie. But the story is beginning with them in the woods. Now, much more sophisticated than simple beginning, middle, ending is the classical three-act structure, where you've taken your story and you break it into three specific different points. And I like to describe three-act structure as something changes, things get worse, pay the price. So something changes is your first act. That you have things going on in your sort of normal world, but at some point an inflection happens where you just can't be in the normal world anymore. Now you are in Act 2, you're in the middle where you're doing things about what changed, but things just keep getting worse until you pay the price. You figure out what the real problem is, often a real internal problem that you have to solve within yourself, so that now finally, instead of things getting worse, things get resolved. Now, that's a sort of traditional, hopeful, optimistic ending. You can also have tragedy where something happens, things get worse, but no matter how bad they get, you refuse to pay the price. Classical Greek tragedy, the actual problem is always in yourself. There's always a change you need to make, and you won't. And so instead of things getting better after that, they get worse and fall off a cliff. Now, this is classical three-act structure. When people discuss this, especially in the film business, they will also talk about a midpoint in the middle of Act 2. Sometimes they call it the false victory or the false defeat. False victory means you thought things were getting better, and after that midpoint, you're going to find out how wrong you were. False defeat is you thought things couldn't get any worse, and after that midpoint, you find out how wrong you were. So they will put a break right in the middle of Act 2. I have no idea, and I've yet to find a cogent explanation for why that isn't a four-act structure, why that isn't Act 1, 2, 3, and 4. But traditionally in these discussions, it's Act 1, Act 2A, Act 2B, and Act 3. I count that as 4, but they're going to tell you it's three-act structure. You just have to accept it. So now, inflection points let you think about your three-act structure. How your beginning leads to your middle has to fit your beginning, and why can't your character turn back at that act break? So for Luke, there's no turning back. There's no farm left, there's no aunt and uncle. Everything that he had sort of dreamed about as a kid, of going out and fighting in the rebellion, it's the only option left for him. There's nothing left here. So that is the question you have to ask at the inflection point. Is you're thinking about making a compelling story, why can't your character just turn back? Because what lies ahead is things get worse. If they just stayed home, things wouldn't get worse. Or they might, but then it's a whole different story. So what makes that an inflection point? And then your middle needs to lead to your ending, which ends up with another inflection point when you break between Act 2 and Act 3. And again, why can't you turn back at that inflection point? So in the case of Star Wars, they have escaped. They don't want to turn back to go back to the Death Star and be captured again. They have to go forward, but they know or learn very quickly that they are being followed and they're going to have to face the Death Star at some point here. And then how does your ending wrap up the beginning and the middle and somehow tie them together and complete them? So your inflection points let you think about, is this really the point where everything changes? So I'm going to give you a very simple story, and we're going to talk about the inflection points in it. So there's a boy named Boris, wanted to fly, all he ever wanted, but he was poor, never had an opportunity. His teacher, as he got a little older, explained Bernoulli's principle and how airplanes get lift. And suddenly Boris realizes there's math and science behind flying. All he ever saw was those wings zooming through the air. Now he realizes something is making those wings work. And so he's decided he's going to study hard. And he also discovers that he has to learn geography, meteorology, regulations. He has to learn to be an informed, intelligent person. And along the way, he's also learning finance. And he'll never get a chance to afford a plane. So he despairs and his grades start to slip. He gets in trouble, sent to the school counselor. Counselor understands Boris's problem and says, there is an answer. You just got to get somebody else to get you the plane. And with help from the guidance counselor, and now he works on his grades all over again because he's proved he can if he's motivated. He gets into the Air Force Academy, becomes a fighter pilot. Eventually, today, he commands his own flight wing. He has responsibilities that don't let him fly as often as like, but he still gets in flight hours every chance he can. He's become a changed person. Okay, really simple story, but look at the inflection points. We have Boris. He wants to fly. It's all he wants to do. He really doesn't see a chance. But here's the inflection point, putting him into Act 2. He learns about the science of flight, the math of flight, and he starts trying really hard. He's going to make it. He's going to become a pilot because he's going to be smart. He's going to be educated. Pilots need to be smart and educated. He's going to be smart, and he learns that he cannot fly. That was the false defeat in this structure. That Boris knows he cannot fly. He'll never be able to afford a plane. He's too poor. And his grades start to slip. He's getting in trouble. Sends the counselor, and the counselor's like, there is a way. We could get you through this. Now he has to, again, inflection point. Now he's got his new goal. He's not turning back. His only chance to achieve his dream is to get into the Air Force Academy. And he's going to do everything he can, learn everything he can, so he can become the fighter pilot. In the process, he kind of had to somewhat give up his dream. He can't fly as much as he'd like, but he's become a guy who helps other people fly. He's a commander of a whole flight wing. So that's our basic Boris story, our very basic story broken into the acts. Now, I want to make a mention to a lesson from Dave Wolverton, also known as David Farland. This is a quote from his $1 Million Outlines, and he also taught this in many of his classes. Sometimes, especially when you're concentrating on short, you can skip one or more of these acts. You can just get to the part where you want to show, for instance, in this example, the things getting worse. And this was one of Dave's favorite Hemingway stories, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. He wrote a story once, sent it to the agent with a note that said, I wrote a story about a man who receives a telegram telling him his son has died in the war. He goes to a bar and gets drunk. Afterward, he gets home and hangs himself. But he cut off the beginning and the end. I think that one scene is enough. They'll get the rest from the tone. Now, if you want to try this, nobody's stopping you. I wouldn't do this. unless I felt in the mood, because I sometimes get in moods. But I wouldn't do this because it's assuming the readers are really going to read into what you put together. Now, in this case, it's one of his most celebrated stories, number of short story collections, so it worked for him. He didn't tell the beginning, he didn't tell the ending, he just told the middle enough to let the people figure out what the story was about. So, yes, acts might be optional. In my experience, flash fiction, which is not my favorite thing unless it's done well, because I've seen a lot of bad flash, but in my experience, flash fiction is often just the beginning. It's just here's what a story would look like, and we're done, because we're trying to keep it down to 200 words or 1,000 words or whatever. We're just trying to tell it till it gets done. So that is, in fact, a way to write flash. To write just the middle, you have to do like Hemingway did. You have to really know how to imply the other pieces. To write just the ending, you have to imply the heck out of everything. I actually have a story, which I think stands well as a 3-act story, but it's also Act 3 of a much larger story. In the book Weird World War 3, no, Weird World War 4. It's an anthology of stories about what happens in World War 4. And I had a great vision, a vision for a story that I said, that's what I want to write. And it was essentially a James Bond adventure in space. Because there's never been any such thing, and I don't want to hear anybody mention that M movie because that is burned from my brain and I never want to see it again. It was so horrendous. No, this is the original James Bond movie in space as far as I'm concerned. About this agent who has to figure out who is smuggling stuff into orbit in a future where orbital society is really, really cluttered with lots of places and factories and settlements and so on. And somebody is smuggling stuff up there, and he has to figure this out by sneaking in as a recruit into the corporation that he thinks is behind it. And he get recruited and taken up into orbit and getting trained and all of this stuff until eventually he finds out what's really going on to some degree is this big complex labor smuggling operation. Not just material smuggling, but labor. They're trying to get people to a particular station in a particular faction. And eventually, after a lot of searching, he discovers that this is actually a platform for a giant fusion bomb effort to bomb the surface of the Earth into submission. And all of the labor that's been smuggled aboard are actually mercenaries to help in the takeover. And he has to lead a team to attack the missile platform and stop it from carrying out its mission. And if you're familiar with many, 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 many James Bond movies, you're familiar with the sort of cavalry scene at the end where the cavalry, the whichever British troops or Japanese troops or whatever, come in to the villain's base to fight with the villain's minions while Bond chases the villain through the base and finally has a confrontation. And I just about described a novel there, and my limit was 8,000 words. I said, how about 12? 8. How about 10? 9. How about 10? Or how about 9? 8. Okay, I'll do 8. By the time I got chopped to what could fit in 8, all I had room for was the ending. I had to start the story with the invasion of the base and just drop hints along the way of how we got there. But that invasion of the base itself followed a 3-act structure. But I really literally wrote the ending and implied the beginning and middle. Now, some of you were here, and hopefully some of you have also watched our South Park Secret episode, which was session 2, I believe. Was it 1? That was 20 weeks ago. I'm fuzzy on it. But the South Park Secret, where your step from every scene, every beat should go either from the last beat should be either therefore this happens, or but this happens, or meanwhile this happens, or eventually this happens. You can use these transition rules to look at broken stories and figure out how you might fix them. So let's break Boris's story. Let's completely break Boris's story. It's the same concept, but it's a different story. Boris wanted to fly, but under pressure from his dad, joined the family business. He went to clown college. He became a successful circus clown, but he'd look up at the aerialists and wish he was up there with them. One day he's on a flight to the clown convention. Here's an announcement over the loudspeaker. Ladies and gentlemen, stewardess, we regret any inconvenience. There's no reason to become alarmed. We hope you enjoy the rest of your flight. By the way, is there anyone on board who knows how to fly a plane? And if you know classic 80s comedy, yes, I stole that entire paragraph from the movie Airplane. So Boris rushes forward, eager to volunteer, with a fright wig and the red nose and squeaky shoes, but he persuades the stewardess, let him fly. He climbs to the pilot's seat, takes a stick, successfully lands the plane. After the landing, a reporter asked him what it felt like to save all those people. Boris shrugged and said, oh, it was nothing. He honks his horn. Any clown can fly a plane. I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. I'm not apologizing for that ending. I am apologizing because I wanted to break the story. And then with that ending, I turned it from a broken story into a bit of a joke. But if we look at this story, it doesn't fit well with beginning, middle, and ending. They don't line up. I kind of brought them together with the joke line at the end, but they really don't fit well. The beginning is a different story from the middle, and then the ending kind of says, well, I'm going to make it clowns and flying because I wanted a joke. So your inflection points ought to be points that kind of belong together, that you're not changing to a whole different story. Now, again, tools, not rules. I guarantee you could do this where you change to a different story, but you're going to have some confused readers when you do. Adding Jenna in. Hello, Jenna. You could certainly have a point where you tell the stories of one group of characters, and at the inflection point, we switch to an entirely different group with entirely different problems, maybe someplace else entirely. And part of what the middle is going to be seeing how these tie together. And the ending could be where you finally bring them together. I'm going to do a spoiler alert, massive spoiler alert. I'm going to spoil and ruin one of my absolute favorite stories, and I'm sorry, but I'm here for an instructional purpose, not to just entertain you. Maybe I'm entertaining. But Spider Robinson wrote a book called Mind Killer. And Mind Killer was about a story that broke into different narratives for two different characters. One was a college professor who was trying to work on life at his local college, trying to just be himself, trying to break the rules where he could because he wanted to teach, not fill out forms, and getting in trouble for it. And the other was actually based on a short story he had published long before about a guy who breaks into an apartment because he's going to burgle it, because he's a burglar. But we don't know this quite yet. But he's in this apartment, and this woman is there plugged into a wire in her brain because science fiction at that point was very, very enamored of the concept of wireheading, where you plug a wire directly into the pleasure center of your brain, and you just sit there and let the current flow in, and you are happy until you basically die in your own feces. And that's what he broke in on, was a woman who had hooked herself up with a wire because she was tired of her life, and this was the way she was going to be happy until it was over. And he nurses her back to health, gets her fed, gets her nutrified, and gets her healthy enough to the point where they can finally have a conversation about why she did this and what was so horrible in his life. And this is when she asks him, but then why are you here? Is it because I'm burgling your apartment? This is weeks after he got there. So something was in his head different from that. So these are the two characters. And in the middle, we start seeing that there are things going on. There's a conspiracy going on. We see that there's a conspiracy where somebody is trying to kill people to protect things, or at least seems to be trying to kill, seems pretty dangerous. Somebody is trying to keep secrets, and these secrets have something to do with mind control and mind programming. And these characters, each of them are hitting the conspiracy from a different angle. And slowly over time, you pick up the hints that these are different times, that the professor is from a time earlier than the burglar, but they're starting to come together. And at the second transition, we start seeing that the professor has gone in and started to try to help people around him. And the burglar and the girl are trying to stop this conspiracy that has already happened in the professor's time frame. And in the ending, we find out that they're actually the same person. And that after the professor made his move to try to stop the conspiracy, they erased his brain. And the burglar is what's left after the erased brain. So that was a story that seemed like you had completely different storylines going on that eventually became a single storyline. So a story isn't necessarily broken if your beginning and your middle and your ending seem to be disjoint, but it's something to look at and analyze and say, are readers going to get this? So there's beginning, middle, and ending as a way to analyze a story. Man. Aristotle had his theory of drama, which built upon beginning, middle, ending in the three-act structure, and his was complication and unraveling. Complication is the rising action that happens in the middle. Challenges or changes, each more engaging than the last. So you need to have that the next thing that happens is even more of a test, more of a challenge than what came before. And then the unraveling is after the last inflection point, falling down to the end of Act 3. Now, what happens when you're looking at your story is the big challenge comes at the beginning. You may have to make the later challenges even bigger. You may have to tell the story out of order. You may need to find a way to downplay the initial challenge or even set it before the story opens. So if your story is post-apocalyptic, man, the end of the world is a pretty big challenge. Nuclear war or a solar flare or whatever, that's a pretty big challenge. It's hard to make the rest of the story as big as that. But it can happen. If you've read Lucifer's Hammer, one of my favorite books, the story is about a comet hitting the Earth. And essentially the first act is all the people studying the comet certain that there's not a chance in a billion that it could hit. Not a chance in a million. I mean, not even a chance in 1,000. Not even a chance in 100. And you're watching society go insane as the odds get closer and closer to the point where, oh, wow, it's going to come real close. And eventually to, oh, wow, it's going to hit. And then we get an entire separate act almost, which is the comet hitting. And we see it from the point of view of many characters. We've seen a lot of characters in the beginning, a lot of different people with their approach to their ordinary life and their awareness of the comet and so on. And now all of a sudden, they're all caught in what happens when this hits. You really don't get much bigger than a comet hitting the Earth in terms of disaster. But now we've still got another almost 2/3 of the book to tell. Now it is, what's the implications of that hitting and watching all these people trying to dig out from that disaster. So you might have your big challenge at the beginning. Most often, the biggest challenge is the second inflection point right before the end. This leads us into Farrell's triangle, the concept of rising action and falling action. Now, this is Farrell's triangle. It's the same beginning, middle, ending, but we've added a second dimension. We've added things rising in the middle and falling in the ending. Now, You're likely to have seen this called Freytag's triangle. David saw from his teacher, his teacher called it Farrell's triangle. And since that's what his teacher called it, David has called it Farrell's triangle. I am going to call it Farrell's triangle. Unfortunately, I cannot, in all of my searching, find hardly any details on who Farrell was at all, whereas Freytag's all over the place. And if I do a deep search on the term Farrell's triangle, eventually every single one of them traces back to Dave. So if you hear the term Farrell's triangle, you are probably hearing a student of Dave or a student of Dave. And as Dave said in $1 Million Outlines, it really is just this 3-act structure, but it's a change to look like things are getting different in the middle. Remember how I phrased it? Something changes, things get worse, pay the price. That middle, where the problems are rising and rising and rising, getting more and more complex, that's the things get worse. And then you pay the price at your climax, and then things get better. So that's out of Dave's book, $1 Million Outlines, one of my favorite writing books ever. If you buy one writing book and it's not making story models, I would recommend buying that book. So the inflection points are literally turning points. The line changes direction. So your Act 1 is the normal world. You get to know the characters and their goals. Act 2 is the rising action. Act 3 is the falling action. The protagonist has learned a lesson, changes, and overcomes, or doesn't, and disaster follows. So that's Farrell's triangle. Here is the triangle for Terminator 2. And notice how short Act 1 is. If you haven't seen Terminator 2 in a while, after the credits, almost immediately after the credits, things start happening. Things get boomy and explodey, and the new Terminator shows up to John Connor and says, "Come with me if you want to live," and gets him out of there. So in Rise of the Machines, we have 3 minutes of war against the machines and 2 minutes of explosions and credits, and then the Terminator arrives, and there's a bar fight, and then the chase begins. But he really didn't need more than that. His audience for Terminator 2 was everyone who loved Terminator 1. Terminator 1, he put his heart into it, but nobody expected it to be quite the success that it was. When it came time for Terminator 2, they realized that people love Terminator 1. He really just needs to pick up the story. He doesn't need much of an Act 1. So he could be very short. Or I have misinterpreted, and this is going to lead us into some of the stuff coming later, but I'll give you a sneak peek. Maybe it's a longer beginning, but it's a beginning that itself has some rising action. It's not a flat beginning, it's a rising beginning. And the rising beginning leads to an inflection point. So the real inflection point to me is when John Connor chooses to trust the Terminator, flee the T-1000. It's your turning point for the audience, because we all know that Arnold as the Terminator, Arnold's the bad guy. We saw that in the first film. So when he takes the offer and gets in the car and flees, now we're into the real middle. Everything before that was just a very exciting Act 1. Act 1 doesn't have to be passive. It can be. Lord of the Rings, early parts of the book are simply people having a party and talking and making plans. But in Terminator 2, that early stuff is all action-packed because it is picking up where the last one left off. Now, on the other hand, we could look at Middle-earth as Tolkien originally was intending it, as he's trying to figure out what he's going to do as a sequel to The Hobbit. And he proceeded to build the entire history of his world building until it became a trap. He lost himself trying to build this entire grand history of the first and second and third ages with The Hobbit being very close to the end of the Third Age, and he had all this stuff going on, and all of a sudden, the Third Age is going to end with a giant shakeup of everything. And his friends and editors said, guys, buddy, this last part here is a really good story. Why don't you just tell that? He told himself he needed that great big long beginning. And sadly, I've met a few new writers that they have to tell that whole great big long beginning, and they have to tell it to the reader. Now, you may need that. When Tolkien wrote the actual Lord of the Rings, which became just the middle and ending part and a little beginning there, he took all of that world building and incorporated it into the narrative that went on, but he didn't have to tell the reader that. That eventually became the Silmarillion, which I, like many geeks, waited and waited and waited to come out, and I understand. I'm sorry for Tolkien fans. I understand why it never got published until he was dead. It didn't have an actual narrative. There were pieces inside it that were narratives, and those could be turned into stories and have been. But as a whole, it was world building. It was not story. So let's go back to Boris's dreams of flying and break it into our acts and our inflection points. So Boris sees an airplane. He takes his first plane ride. He wants to fly. That's our inflection point. Boris has become a changed kid. So now he starts studying, he learns Bernoulli, he studies math and science, he studies geology, meteorology, he studies finance and realizes that he doesn't have what it takes to buy a plane, but he gets, with the teacher's help, he gets accepted in the academy, and now he can go into his training, his mission, more training, more missions, get promoted, and Boris has become a commander of a flight wing. So there is Boris's story broken in to Ferrol's Triangle. But maybe the story is broken. Let's tell a slightly different story. So he sees an airplane, takes his first plane ride, decides he wants to fly, meets a pilot at the airport who teaches him how to fly, and he gets his license. And if Boris's goal is to become a pilot and to fly, he's just succeeded. Things after that are kind of anticlimactic. Notice that that word is literal here. The real climax was right there. And now he gets into the airplane. He gets into finance and realizes he needs to get to the academy. He gets accepted, and then everything after that is sort of an aftermath. That is a story that just takes forever to finish. Now, some people have said the same about The Lord of the Rings, that after the ring is gone, Tolkien spends another whole half a book getting them home. I happen to love that half of the book. I felt like it was a necessary conclusion to the stories of the different characters. But it was a long denouement. So look and see where your actual triumph happens, where your goal is achieved, and see how close that is to the ending. Now, there's a way to fix this. We might say that it is two peaks. He gets his chance to get his license. He starts flying some charters, but the charter service closes. So now he's trying to figure out how to buy his own plane. Now he studies finance. Now he gets accepted in the academy. And now he's the academy grad, and things go on, and he has a great life. It's possible for a character to have more than one goal, goals that are evolving over time, or it's even possible for a character to have two stories. That the first goal is one Boris story, and the second goal is a second Boris story. Now, we talked about the goal game before, and this was an example where if you take your goal game, you can color where the acts kind of are. So your first act is someone wanting something. What do they want? Why can't they have it? The second is all the ways that trying to get it makes things worse because they're not understanding the real problem. The third act is they learn what the real problem is. They change their goal or they change their tactics and proceed on to their final plan. So Let's give Boris a different goal. And suddenly all of the events that we just looked at make perfect sense. Boris doesn't just want to be a pilot. Boris wants to be Top Gun. So Boris decides he wants to be not a pilot, a fighter pilot. So just like before, he meets the pilot at the airport. Pilot teaches him to fly. He gets his license. He starts flying charters, but the charter service closes, and Boris realizes he really needs to do what it takes to get into the academy. He thought having experience as a charter pilot would be enough to get him in. Now he realizes he needs to do more on his academics to get in the academy. It is the same steps, but he started with a different initial goal. And so the things going on along the way were just part of the rising action. All we did is change his goal, and we tweaked the events a little bit. We changed the goal, and now we add in some introspection. We need to know early that flying isn't enough for Boris. He needs to be Top Gun. And now we have the ability to add in try-fail cycles. And again, Dave taught these a lot. Algis Budrys, who was Dave's teacher, taught these a lot. Neither one of them originated the concept. They've been around a long time, but they did some good teaching on the concept that along the way, it's a really boring story if things just work the whole way. It becomes a more interesting story when you fail in your attempts. And because you failed, now you have to try harder. And you try harder and you fail harder, leading up to the try that changes things, because you're not just changing tactics, you're changing yourself. Going back to Dave, difference between Farrell's triangles in this chart is there have to be attempts made to resolve the problem. They must fail. If you succeed on the first attempt, it doesn't feel like it was a big deal. No, why are we studying this story? It didn't have the heft. 2 attempts aren't needed. There is kind of built into our psychology, you need at least 3 attempts to get the problem solved. Now, if you do too many attempts, it starts to feel like just the old Republic movie serials, where every week we end on the cliffhanger and we solve it, and every week we end on another cliffhanger and we solve it, and every week we end on another cliffhanger. But you really need to be looking at 3 attempts and fails before 2 attempts and fails, and then the last attempt, something changes. If you don't have at least that much, you've got a brittle, weak story. So this was Dave's teaching based on Algis's teaching, based on going back hundreds of years on the concept of try-fail cycles. So here we look at Boris's story again, and now we put explicit try-fails in here. He's hanging out at the airport, but TSA doesn't like loiterers at the airport. I one time had a flight that arrived at home, and my niece was flying out that afternoon on a flight to Florida, and her parents had asked me to escort her. So I basically had 6 hours to kill at the airport after a long time of travel. So I took a nap on the floor and got woken up by TSA guards who did not like people sleeping at the airport for no reason in the middle of the day. I had to show them that, yes, I really do have a ticket that I just arrived on and a ticket I'm leaving on, and I don't want to, in a 6-hour block, spend an hour driving home and an hour driving back and 2 hours waiting. I'd just rather stay here. So they don't like loiterers. So he gets very stubborn, so he gets photographed, printed, put in a file, and told, stay away. He has a record now. He can't hang around the airport. But he can't surrender his dreams of flight. Somehow, someday, he's got to be a pilot. He gets good grades, takes a side job at the local paper, learns of an air show coming to the next town over. Next town over, different airport. Maybe they won't know him. Spends his hoarded money to see all the planes in the exhibition. He must feel it. He knows better. He tries to sneak through security gates so he can get up close and touch the fighter jet. But he gets arrested. He's facing charges now because, yes, they do share their knowledge with the other airports, and breaking through the gate is bad. But while he's on the tarmac, a pilot overhears him, remembers being that kid. He bails Boris out. He's a fighter pilot. He takes Boris under his wing, teaches him everything so he's ready to learn about airplanes. Jack takes him on a training flight, A crucial moment during the flight, he has a medical emergency. Boris is forced to fly the plane and with help from control tower to land it. Fire and ambulance are waiting, expecting the worst, but Boris brings it in for a landing they can walk away from, which is all the pilot really hopes for. Fire foam is unneeded. Ambulances are there to take Jack to the hospital. Before he pulls away, Jack croaks out, "You're going to be a hell of a flyer, Boris." Okay, we didn't even get to the academy. This was his first story, but we've broken it now into try-fails. He keeps having things fail. Now, when you're doing try-fails, again, going back to Dave's $1 Million Outlines, go buy the book, go read the book. One of the things he talks about is broadening and deepening, because each try-fail should be bigger than the last. And in Dave's way of explaining it, it needs to be broader or deeper or both. Broadening is more people are affected. Deepening is it becomes more personal. So Dave used an example of a detective studying missing girls in the town. And somebody is kidnapping and worse with young girls in the town. And broadening is more girls getting abducted. Maybe even some of them who are important, escalating the social stakes. Maybe one of them is the mayor's daughter. So now this is becoming a very broad conflict with lots of impact on the society as a whole. Deepening is when the detective's daughter gets kidnapped or one of her close friends, something that brings it right close to home, so you're escalating the personal stakes. Really good principle as you're looking at these try-fail cycles is ask yourself, did I broaden or did I deepen? And if you didn't do either one, go back and try to make it more impactful. Broaden or deepen or both. So those are our try-fail cycles. And then I talked about Chester, scene and sequel, so the chance to think. So you structure your try-fail cycles with your scenes and sequels. Scene is where things happen. Sequel is time to reflect. They're not always sequential. Sometimes you have scene, 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 sequel, sequel. Because the action was so tense that you just had to keep going to the next action scene, the next. There was no time to stop and reflect. Okay. So we're going to take Farrell's triangle now, go back to Dave's lessons on that, and we're going to see where I started to have problems with this. And 11 years ago now, I was at the Writers of the Future workshop meeting Dave. He was teaching this, and at a break, I asked him, but I'm confused. Because on the triangle in general, when we hit the middle and things are getting worse, we climb up. And when things are getting better, we slide back down. But when we're drawing our try-fail cycles, when things are getting better or hopeful because we're trying to change things, we go up. And when we fail, we go down. So on the left, going up is bad, going down is good. On the right, going up is good and going down is bad. Which is it? I couldn't make sense of this. And Dave just shrugged and said, that's just the way we've always drawn it. And he said, just try it and you'll see. And it drove me nuts. And I loved Dave. Dave was absolutely one of my favorite mentors. Dave was a person I learned so much from. He was wrong on this one. But he was wrong because many, many people were wrong before him. And that, we'll skip the exercise here. We're way past time for exercise. That leads us to this gentleman, Kurt Vonnegut. And this is like a 15-minute video, so I'm not actually going to play it here, but I encourage you to capture that link and go watch it. We'll put it into the chat. It's Vonnegut explaining a technique that I came to call fortune graphs. He didn't give it a name, but since it came from Vonnegut and it's about fortune, that's what I called it, fortune graph. So you graph fortune. Now, fortune is a very nebulous term. We're not doing critical math here. We're doing concepts. Fortune over time, and it is fortune as your characters perceive it. You might have a different graph for what the reader knows. The reader might know different than the character does. But fortune, you go from good at the top to ill at the bottom. And you go from beginning at B to ending at E. Now, I add to Vonnegut's concept history, things that happened before the story began. And then I add in the act breaks. You see your little dash lines there for the act breaks. And what you do then is you draw how fortune changes over time. And so when you draw it that way, Farrell's triangle is just an upside down fortune graph. Take Farrell's triangle and flip it upside down, and oh, that works just well. It's a mathematical inversion. So you've got your act one, where you're in kind of your normal world, and then your act two, something changed and things are getting worse. So your fortune is going down, and at your third inflection, or at your second inflection point, breaking into third act, now things start getting better again. But now, when we put our tri-fails on, they make sense. Because climbing up is always good, and falling down is always bad. Down is bad, whether you're on the whole triangle or you're on a tri-fail. Try is you're trying to bring your fortune back up, and fail is you made it worse. Trying again is you're trying to fix what you did wrong and you made it worse. And now you're trying really hard because now you've learned what you're doing wrong, and now you get back up where you need to go. So everything makes sense to me. Perfect sense now. My confusion over Farrell's triangle with tri-fails is gone. It makes perfect sense. But if that was all it is, it's really just, it's like, it's a slightly different way of drawing things. But now we can start to play with this concept. So this is one of the fortune graphs that Vonnegut talked about. In his 60-minute video, he talks about a lot of them. But this is one he calls Boy Meets Girl. It starts out a little above neutral. The middle line is neutral because people don't like to hear boring stories or depressing stories. That was what he stated, and then later on he showed that people love some depressing stories. But we start out kind of neutral, and Boy Meets Girl, and wow, we climb up. We are like, way, it's just a fantastic thing. Everything is going great. And then at the inflection point, something's going wrong. We stop climbing, and pretty soon we're plummeting because boy lost girl. And then we have boy trying to fix things and makes it worse, and trying really hard to fix things and making it worse because he hasn't really understood what he's doing and what her concerns are. He has to learn to see her side of it. And when he learns to see her side of it, now he starts climbing up. And when he finally gets her attention and is like, no, really, I am trying to do what's right for us, not just me. Then he climbs up to fortune, incredible, satisfying fortune through the roof. Now, Vonnegut called this Boy Meets Girl, but it really doesn't have to be boy or about a girl. It's discovery versus worthiness. So they're happy with the status quo. They discover something better. And then they lose the discovery. And now the status quo that they're at doesn't feel any good. If he had never met the girl or made the discovery, whatever, he'd have been perfectly happy where he was. Now it's not good. Now every attempt to gain the discovery actually pushes it farther away. He has to learn to be worthy of the discovery. When he's finally worthy, they can go back to the upward path they were on. So there's one Vonnegut example. And then Vonnegut showed many other examples, but then this is where I part ways with Vonnegut. There's actually two versions of that video out there. He gave that talk at two different universities, and he's got videos from each of them. And at one of them, he introduced this fortune graph concept, and at another one, he said, and it's pointless, it's useless, it's a waste of time. Because here is what you see with Hamlet, where we have the father died, the mother remarried the uncle, and where Horatio is introduced as the ghost, and Hamlet talks to the ghost, and we stage a play because I still don't know what's going through Shakespeare's head. The play fails. We stab the drapes, in the process killing Polonius instead of who we thought we were killing. Hamlet duels, and Hamlet dies. And Vonnegut's saying, this is obviously a sucky story, right? Nobody would ever study this story because nothing changes on the fortune graph. Nothing is happening. And so Vonnegut's point, and he's wrong, his point was that the fortune graph can't tell you whether a story is any good or not. Looking at a fortune graph, this looks like a boring, flat story. Fortune starts bad, no matter what he does, it never gets better, but it's a timeless classic. With all due respect, nobody's promising you a good story from a fortune graph. It's a tool, not a rule. It's a way of planning, a way of analyzing. It's not a magic feather that's going to solve all the problems. But on top of that, he got it wrong. In my opinion, this is the actual fortune graph. So when he decides, he's talking to the ghost, he gets to the point where he thinks, okay, my life sucks, but if I do this play, the play is going to be the thing that shows the conscience of the king. Did I get that from the right play? I always forget. So he stages the play and it actually fails. So he had hope. His fortune was rising and then it plummeted. And then he ends up to the point where he's going to stab the drapes. He's kind of the guy and he kills Polonius and drops. But so now he's going to duel. He's going to duel and he fails and he dies. It's not a flat graph. Sorry, Mr. Vonnegut, I appreciate your genius, but it's not a flat graph. It is a graph that starts bad and just keeps getting worse, but has try-fails. He thinks he'll improve his fortune. He even temporarily sees improvements because fortune is subjective. But there are false improvements, plans fail, because this is a tragedy. And that's something that you can get that you couldn't get from Farrell's triangle. There's no way in Farrell's triangle to tell the difference between a triumph and a tragedy because they all have the triangle shape. And once you're into Vonnegut's fortune graphs, they don't necessarily have the same shapes. We have on the left a triumph. Something changes, things get worse, pay the price, and we get back to success. On the right is the tragedy. Something changes, things get worse. When you have the chance to pay the price to make things better, you don't have it in you. And you don't pay the price and you fall off the bottom of the graph. Amen. We already saw all this. All right. But I like to add history as an option Vonnegut didn't discuss. History is what happened before the story that might affect your writing of the story. So, Itsy Bitsy Spider went up the water spout. There is your beginning, and it's a rising beginning. And then you have your second act. Down came the rain and washed the spider out, and we have our fall back down. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain, and the itsy bitsy spider went up the spout again. Everything there after the beginning is the classic nursery rhyme. Everything before that is what makes this a story about futility. If you know that the spider has been doing this exact same series of actions over and over and over, never learning, this becomes a much sadder story. Without that, it feels like a hopeful story that the spider has tried to fix the problem and trying hard and persisting. But when you see the history, you say, oh, wow. Yep, because the spider never learns. They persist because nothing's getting any better. And maybe you shouldn't make your web in a water spout. So the history gives us context of the story. What was the fortune like? Is there a trend? Are there cycles? Was there some shift? And it's going to affect the behavior of the characters or not if they aren't prone to figuring out their lessons. And it may be reflected in the world around them. And it might become part of the exposition. If the nursery rhyme were longer than a single stanza, we might have a chance to realize that this is the spider's 17th attempt to build a web in this water spout. This is one that, again, Vonnegut did in one of his videos, the Cinderella talk. Notice how he said nobody likes stories that start out depressing, but Cinderella starts out depressing. And if you just ignore the history, what happens is Cinderella's in really bad shape. And she hears about a ball, and she'd love to go to the ball, and her stepmother and her stepsisters mock her and give her more work. So there's no chance, even if she could somehow wrinkle an invitation, there's no chance she could get to the ball. She is doomed, 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 until at the inflection point, the act breaks, she meets a fairy godmother and fortune starts climbing up. The godmother gets her shoes. The godmother gets her a dress. The godmother gets her a carriage and mice to be the carriage master or the carriage drivers, and up and up and up. And she goes to the middle point, and she's at the ball. And at the middle point, the prince sees her, and they're dancing, and her fortune is just incredible, like you'd never seen before. And bong, 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 as the chimes are sounding for midnight, and her fortune plummets almost straight down, and she runs away because she doesn't want to be revealed as just a common serving girl. She runs back home, but notice her fortune is not as low as it used to be. Even though she's lost that great world she was in, she knows what life can be. She has the memories. And then, of course, along comes the fairy godmother making sure she has the shoes. Along comes the prince looking for people who can fit the shoes. And she gets the chance to finally go and put the shoes on and reveal who she really is. And she marries the prince, and she's off forever after. The history that I added on this is pretty commonly part of the story, but you only generally pick it up in backstory, which is at one point she had a normal life, and then her mother died and things got bad. And her father married the stepmother and brought in the stepsisters. So that's how she ended up at the low point where things started. And again, it's just one story that fits this pattern. There are many other examples where you start out bad, you get a chance to reach a high point, you lose it. And then you have to decide what you're going to do now that you've lost it. So you learn of the high fortune world, you get a mentor that helps you, gets you to aspire to high fortune. You're not cast down as far after, you have a new perspective. And then optionally, you can scale the heights again, only this time it's real and it's earned. A far better version of this exact same story, and I forget the title. Drew Barrymore did a sort of medieval fantasy, which was essentially the Cinderella story, like Ever After or something like that. But she earns everything that happens to her to change her fortunes. It's not some fairy godmother giving her things. She's earning it. And in the end, when she recovers what she lost, she earns that as well. That was the first movie where I actually started paying attention that she is a pretty good actress. She'd just been a bunch of roles that I didn't care for. That one I started to say, oh wow, she can carry a story. This one is not one of Vonnegut's pictures. This is one that I drew for a genre that Mike Resnick, Papa Mike, used to be very fond of, called the picaresque. And if you're not familiar with the term, the basic concept of a picaresque is lovable scoundrels who get a chance at great success and then through their own often comic mistakes lose it and get in so much trouble that now they have to try even harder, and they tend to end up failing again in spectacular fashions and failing and failing and failing. But they're also always succeeding. And by the end, they generally end up where they started. But along the way, they have a roller coaster ride of fortune, up and down and up and down. And every episode in the larger story is bigger and more extravagant than the one that came before. Some examples, Han Solo and Chewbacca. Up until they got caught up in the grand, larger story of Star Wars, this was kind of their adventures. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse are a classic sword and sorcery, low-level sword and sorcery group. Hope and Crosby, if you watch the road movies, it is always getting themselves into more trouble and getting out of it with a bigger scheme and more trouble and a bigger scheme and more trouble. So your plans get them into trouble. Then the bigger plans get them out, narrow escape, but now this bigger plan also fails to pay off, so they need another plan, and the cycle repeats. So that's fortune graphs, the basic concept. Now let's start playing with them farther. I mentioned earlier that other people can have their own fortune graphs, different characters within the same story. You might have opposing fortune graphs where you have the protagonist graph and the antagonist graph, and they are opposing each other. And every time the protagonist is losing, the antagonist is winning. So they have their own fortune. And sometimes it can be a good graph to look at to see what's happening to the antagonist as we're following the protagonist. Most straightforward case is if I'm losing, you're winning, and vice versa. But there are other approaches. This one is what I call the contest graph. This is the sort of story where two characters are competing for the same goal and only one of them can have it. It might be a romantic interest. It might be a job. It might be a treasure. The concept with the contest graph is they're both sort of starting out kind of the same. You might have that vary depending on how you want your story to open. But for the most of the story, the antagonist keeps managing to get ahead of the protagonist. Because that's part of what's spurring the protagonist on is not only am I failing, but he's succeeding. And so you tend to have the ups and downs that whenever the antagonist tries something, they do a little better than the protagonist. And then towards the end, heading towards the end of Act 2, this is where the protagonist has their real doom and gloom failure, is when the antagonist seems to have won, seems to have the unstoppable advantage. And the protagonist has to learn, has to figure out, how am I screwing this up? What is wrong with me? What does he have over me? And when they can figure that out, we end up with a final successful chase. It might be a race, a chase, treasure hunt. Each of them has their own fortune, roughly parallel, but the antagonist usually slightly higher, and then the antagonist pulls off at the end for the big finish. Let's look at a better romance graph than Vonnegut's. Because Vonnegut's was kind of very centered on the boy part of Boy Meets Girl. And there's nothing saying that the girl part couldn't be the same, but maybe the reason why the boy is failing is partly because he's not recognizing the girl's goals. So the boy started out pretty happy with life. The girl started out with ambition. She's not happy with things where they are. She's trying to change her world. She's trying to advance in her job or something like that. And she's actually climbing. She's actually going up on it right to the point where she meets this irresistible boy. And as the boy is seeing this, seems to get better and better and better, she's distracted because her original goal was not meet some guy. Her original goal was get success in some part of life. And as much as she's enjoying her time with the guy, it's pulling her off that goal. And so her fortune, her goal fortune is actually going down. Even though her romantic fortune might be going up, her goal fortune is going down. And at the inflection point, the break in the acts is where she says, I really need more time to get back to my work. I really have to. I'm sorry. I would love to spend time with you, but I need to do this. And she starts pulling away, not on the same trajectory she had been, but she's pulling away and his fortune is dropping. And when he hits bottom, notice how she feels kind of bad about that because she did like the guy. So as he climbs in his goal, she's tending to drop back down. She's tending to say, oh, but I'll just go out for drinks with him. It'll just be tonight. So every time he's trying to make things better for him, he's actually pulling her away from her goal. And his point, his inflection point where he realizes what he's doing wrong is maybe when her friend comes to him and kicks him upside the head and says, look, she needs this. This has been her goal her whole life, and you are pulling her away from it. And you need to, if you really care, you need to let go and let her do this. And that's when he changes his approach to try to be somebody who is supportive of the goal instead of distracting from the goal. And now he is actually doing things to encourage as she's climbing, so that at the end, he's finding a way to be there, what she needs him to be, as she climbs toward her goal. As I just described here, pretty much. Here's one that I actually don't have the finished graph for, I think. Don't go near the scenic cliff. I have a video on this one that I'll share at some point. But it was the concept of don't go near the scenic cliff was there is something that's out there tempting people. In Jaws, it's the wonderful summer beach, tempting people to go out there, that even though there's shark out there, we're going to keep going out. And every time people get close to the real danger, you pull them back in, but the danger is still out there. The temptation is still out there. And so slowly over time, we keep seeing the fortune in the eyes of the person who knows the danger. We see it getting worse and worse and worse. I thought I had a finished drawing on this one. I'll get you one. All right. So that was our concept of fortune graphs, where fortune is from good to ill. How are we doing? But now we can do other sorts of polar graphs where we have a positive and a negative extreme. A mystery graph is a story where the mystery is what we're measuring. The known, K at the top, versus the unknown, U at the bottom. And so this is a story that starts out with some history. That there have been things going on deep in the background, things we didn't know about. So the story starts already with a mystery. And then things start happening, clues start piling up, but the clues aren't helping. They're making things worse. Our knowledge is going down. And then we pick up a little bit, and then our knowledge gets worse because the clues, we thought they made sense, but they're still not. And so you see this up and down, that you get some clues, but they contradict what you already know, or they lead to dead ends, until eventually you hit the real rock bottom where you know there's danger out there. You know there's a problem to be solved out there, but you're not looking at it right. You need to put the pieces together. And when you finally put the pieces together right, you can start to climb up to the side on the Act 3. So vertical axis is knowledge, horizontal axis is time, and the known versus unknown is what you're charting. So this, for example, is a graph of Beverly Hills Cop. And I've mentioned before, I love this as a mystery movie, but it is essentially a very linear movie. There's really no subplots. It pretty much all follows the linear path. But we start out with Act 1, where Axel, we all know he's Eddie, but we'll call him by his character name, Axel. Axel and Mikey are having a good time. Axel has met his buddy from way back when. He meets his buddy. His buddy gives him some clues about what's going on in Los Angeles and Beverly Hills right before Mikey gets killed, and the knowledge drops way down. And his boss says, you can't go investigate this. You are not to go investigate this. And Axel takes his vacation and goes out to investigate this. So he starts to learn something. He meets his old friend who works at Maitland's place, and he learns about Maitland, and then he gets thrown out, and before he can actually learn more. And now he's out there trying to figure out, with the help of his two detectives who are supposed to be watching him but are becoming his allies, where he's learning what's going on with Maitland. And at the end, he starts to figure out that, hey, this is a big drug smuggling operation, but they have kidnapped the girl, and we have to figure out where they're at. And we go to this house, and we have a big action finish where we learn everything that's going on. Very simple mystery graph. And I just explained it. All right, this is a typical Twilight Zone graph, which is a mystery graph. If you have not watched old Twilight Zone especially, this is a common structure. It's not the only structure, but this is a common structure. We start out with a kind of known world, and things get a little weird. Just enough to make the reader or the viewer say, I wonder what's going on here. Right up until the commercial break, where something gets really weird. Because they want you hooked to sit through the commercial. They want you hooked to say, what's going to happen now? And after the commercial, you start to learn a little bit, but you're now spending the whole Act 2A with, but I still don't understand. This person's going through life and things have changed, but I don't understand. And then a big change happens right in time for the midpoint of the episode. And now we are dropped way down into the wow, this world is weird. And we climb back up out of the next commercial break into the Act 2B, where it's like, okay, now they're trying to figure out how they're going to survive in this world. And they just keep learning new things that make no sense. And they drop down to the point where in Act 3, they are nearly impossible. We can't understand this. It's getting so strange. And a new twist comes. And suddenly, for the viewer, if not necessarily for the character, near the very end, all of a sudden it clicks in, aha, I see what's going on. It all makes sense now, and you climb up to perfect knowledge of the story. The character might or might not, sometimes the character might not even survive this part, but the viewer now sees what's really going on finally. But here's a different Twilight Zone graph. This is one of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes ever. It is an episode called Spur of the Moment by Richard Matheson, who is one of the best Twilight Zone authors and did many other great horror and dark fantasy stories in the 60s, 70s. Matheson was a genius. We have two graphs here. We have the graph for the character, Anne, and she gets the dash graph. And we have a graph for the viewer, which is the solid graph. And notice that they're not the same, because Anne and those things are going to be told to us later, but we don't know them starting out. But the story starts out with Anne on her horse, young Anne, very young, impressionable, beautiful, but just young and seemingly carefree, riding her horse through the grounds. And we're watching this, and suddenly up on top of a hill, a figure in black on a black horse starts screaming at her. Screaming, yelling, and starts charging down the hill on the black horse. And at this point, both our knowledge and Anne's knowledge go way down, because neither of us knows who the Black Rider is, but we can tell this is danger, and Anne's scared and she has to get away. And she rides home as fast as she can. And she gets ahead. She outruns the rider in black, and she's managing to get home safe. And she runs into the house after tying up her horse and goes in the house, and her parents are there. And her parents don't want to hear this. And now we get into a point where our knowledge continues to drop because we don't know the family situation like Anne does. So Anne's knowledge here isn't much changing. It's a little bit. There's still some mysteries out there, but we're still having to learn what's going on. What's going on is Anne and her family and her fiance are all there to plan the engagement party that's coming up. And Anne doesn't want to get engaged to this guy. This is the guy her parents picked for her. This is not the guy she picked. And we are seeing that she is trying her best to talk about this thing that scared her so much, and nobody listens. Nobody cares. They all care about their plans. They're ignoring her just like they always do. And she's trying to figure out how to explain this to them. And about then, her boyfriend, the one she wants to marry, shows up. And so now our knowledge starts to pick up. When we see the boyfriend, we start figuring out a little bit of the backstory of what's going on with the parents and the fiance, while her knowledge is still kind of dropping down because she just wants to figure out, first of all, what's with this strange person who chased her, and second of all, how she's going to get out of this, because she just doesn't want this. And the boyfriend and the fiance almost have a fight. And finally, Anne is going and saying, I'm just tired of all of this. I'm going up to my room. I'm getting away from all of you. This is a pattern we're going to see Anne following. When she really doesn't like or understand what's going on, she runs away. And all of a sudden, we get a literal fade dissolve, like you see sometimes in parodies, where the image fades and fades and fades and warbles like it's underwater, and it comes clear again. We have a different knowledge level for Anne, but our knowledge level gets immediately confused because the first thing we see is the rider in black pulling up into the courtyard and tying off her horse and coming into the house. And we're really confused as she comes into the house, slams the door, and leans back against it, and it's Anne, 25 years older. And all of a sudden, our knowledge level starts climbing up again. That the Anne at that point in late Act 2 is old Anne. Old Anne is well aware of everything that just happened. Well aware that in the history before this, young Anne went out and rode her horse to get away from her parents. So the history was, again, young Anne trying to get away from all her problems until she meets old Anne, but doesn't recognize her on the hill. And so now we start to make sense of, oh, wait, that was somehow crossing time. That was old Anne. And she knows something that's going on. And old Anne starts arguing with her mother about how they're going to lose the house very soon because her father left them debt-ridden and never taught her to stand up for herself. And she never learned to actually run her own life. She let everybody else tell her what to do. And so we're starting to see this picture. We're starting to understand what's going on with Anne. And we're starting to hear her mother complaining about how that lout of a husband with all of his gambling and drinking, he was the real problem. And Anne's like, yeah, I know. And I never was able to do anything about it. And the husband comes in and starts shouting and making an ass of himself. And it's the boyfriend that she was not supposed to marry. Because you've been set up to this point to see it as tragic lovers and thinking of her running away from the boyfriend is her taking charge of her life and doing what she wants. And no, the mistake was marrying exactly who she was told not to, was not a triumph. It was a mistake. And suddenly then we see a flashback to the night where she'd had the chase and she'd had the fights, and we see her at the engagement party out on the porch, and she is just fretting over the fact that no one's listening to her, no one's letting her run her life, and the boyfriend is off in the woods whistling, and she goes off and joins the boyfriend, and they run away and elope. And then we come back to old Anne as her life falls apart, and she goes out on her horse to run up onto the hill to try to chase young Anne down and stop her from making this mistake. And now we understand what she understood. I've just spoiled one of my absolute favorite Twilight Zone episodes. Watch it anyway. But what I like about it, besides the fact that it's Matheson, it's brilliant, is how at the end, her knowledge and our knowledge are tied back together, and you capture that on this graph. So the graph is a good way of analyzing how character knowledge changed across the story. We're going to try to get through the rest of these fairly quickly because we are way over time. I did kind of tell you that was likely to happen. A phantasmagoria graph. Idea of phantasmagoria as a story structure Paul D. Filippo likes. He calls it phantasmagoria. No backstory, no nothing. Drop you right into a future world or a fantasy world, some sort of alternate reality, sink or swim. Don't explain it. He felt like this is the best way to let you, as a reader, experience just how exotic this world is. And then trust that the world will figure out the surprises, figure out the world with some surprises. As you tell the story, the reader's knowledge will catch up. A portal fantasy is almost phantasmagoria, except that a portal starts with characters in the normal world dropped into the phantasmagoria. You might combine graphs again. You might combine your portal fantasy with a fortune graph. because as you put fortune in, you see how not understanding the world endangers their fortune. On this line, the dashed line is fortune, the solid line is knowledge. As they start to learn things, part of what they learn is, oh, wow, we're more screwed than we thought we were. We start learning the world and learning how much trouble we're really in until we learn enough to dig ourselves out of it. Horror and mystery. Horror is a similar graph where you have safety at the top and terror at the bottom. And as this graph shows, often figuring out the dashed line, figuring out what's really going on adds to your terror, because figuring out what the monster really is can tell you, oh, wow, we are screwed. The only book that ever literally frightened me is Legacy of Heorot by Niven, Purnell, and Barnes. And there's a point in that book where I literally dropped the book and said, oh my God, they are all screwed. They're all going to die. Because the knowledge a character had just gained, although I figured it out a whole page before she did, the knowledge she had just gained revealed how bad the danger really was. So sometimes you have to learn to survive the danger, but sometimes what you learn is, oh, wow, are we in danger? Comedy is a different graph from knowledge. It is funny versus somber. And you can match your fortune versus your comedy. And very often, what's funniest is your fortune going down. The more your fortune gets worse, the more chances you have for jokes. But there's often a point in the middle where they sync up, or they sort of sync up, where now you have learned an important thing, a thing you have to change. Now you are still working on the funny as you solve your fortune problem. So you solve it in a funny way. Other things you might graph: justice versus injustice, community isolation, independence, control, love, hate, friendship, enmity, hope, grief. Anytime you've got an emotion which you can put onto two extremes, one comforting and one stressful, you can turn that into a graph. But if you try to put too many perspectives on a single graph, it may get hard to follow. Remember what I talked about with the everything graph. You might sometimes want to do split graphs for different characters. But then I'm going to show you the river graph where I do exactly that, a bunch on one graph. But I'll eventually split those off. So a river graph is a graph where you have some unity of story, and then you have a whole bunch of different fortune graphs in between. This is exactly an example, in fact, of Lucifer's hammer. The kind of in the beginning, everybody's having roughly the same fortune. Of the world is getting tense and anxious because there's a comet coming, and then the comet hits, and now we start seeing the individual fortunes of all these different characters. And all of them have their own fortune graph within that span up until the Act 3, where all of their fortunes start getting tied together in a battle for, are we going to rebuild civilization or are we going to fall into chaos? So you have multiple protagonists, multiple storylines, and the river graph shows where you have the big, deep river and the small, narrow tributaries, individual streams that cross back and forth. All right, so that's a general introduction to structure and acts and inflection points and Vonnegut's fortune graphs, which I think are much more important than Vonnegut thought they were. Questions on that? All right, then let's talk about our schedule coming up. Next week is our last episode of Making Story Models, and we're going to talk about some other models. And then we'll be talking about what we've learned from Kevin and Rebecca, talk about Free Fall and Spin on October 19th, Marketing for Introverts on the 26th, Learning from Improv on the 2nd, Openings on the 9th, Story Strategies on the 16th, Orbits and Transfers on the 23rd, What I've Learned from Jack McDevitt on the 30th, and on the 7th I will be talking about copyright. Any questions? Again, these are my stories I am recommending this week. Take a look at A Fine and Dangerous Season. I think I will surprise you. I surprised my brother-in-law, and books don't surprise him. He's been reading way more than me for almost as long. I one of the most read people I know, and I surprised him with it. All right. So that will give us the end of Fortune Graphs and Beyond.
Thanks, Martin. I following along with the book, and it's good to have the explanation in person as well. I come up with some of my own examples further, along. It makes sense when I have my own examples, and then you give yours as well. It just makes further sense. I'll be traveling the next few weeks or so. So if I can get on, I can. If I can't, I can't. But I appreciate you sharing the stuff online because I try to catch up. So thank you for doing this. I always really appreciate it.
Thank you, and safe travels.
Appreciate it.
All right. Other questions? All right. In that case, I will stop our recording and let you all go. Thank you.